Hello, this is Michael Hexter, and welcome to Politics 2100 here on YouTube. So, in this episode, I'm going to be reviewing a book by Clara e Mattei. It's The Capital Order. The full title is The Capital Order: How Economists Invented Austerity and Paved the Way to Fascism. So I was exposed to this to Professor Mattei's work when she was interviewed on the Majority Report, Sam Seder's program on YouTube and other platforms. And I would say this book is an intellectual history or an economic history, a combination of those two things, of the period 1914, 1915 to 1925, maybe 1927 at the latest. And it's really about how economists created or helped create a new regime in many countries in Europe. The focus is on Britain and Italy in this book. And this is where Mattei's research has focused, and she's done so just let me first take the first part of this review just to sort of summarize in brief, again, with obviously lacunae, because this is a 300-page book, and there's also with copious notes and in the back as well, beyond those 300 pages. So this is a very thoroughly researched book. I think it's a very good example of an economic history or a intellectual history of economics in that period. And I think it has some biases and some, a framework which Mattei works with that I have slight disagreement with, or I think is slightly distorting of that material. But first, let me, recap what she said, what her basic argument is in her book, and then discuss what I thought was missing, what I thought where it might have been different, where it might have been, in my opinion, better or more complete. But anyway, so this book starts again during the beginning of World War I, or it discusses the economic philosophy of the leaders of countries like England and Italy, but also other countries, the economic ideas that the governments were operating with as they were trying to fight this war against each other, sometimes this philosophy often was the laissez-faire philosophy that was dominant in Europe in the United States in the late 19th century and early 20th century, laissez-faire meaning very similar in a way to some philosophies that we currently have in the United States, with some differences in that. So anyway, the state apparatuses of various countries had only started to grow in terms of becoming providers of social welfare, and or also just doing economic studies or statistical studies of the population that grew enormously throughout in different countries at different levels and different speeds. But from the late 19th to the early 20th century, but it really started to grow even faster during the First World War. But anyway, the philosophy that the governments were trying to fight World War II with was that the idea that the markets would provide the armaments, would provide labor, so forth and so on, that would create the war effort for those countries fighting as they were, in this rather this very tragic and awful conflict, senseless conflict in a way, of World War One, and in more than, in not one way, in many ways, senseless conflict. So, but anyway, uh, one, let's say, upside of this war from the economic perspective was that then the governments realized that they couldn't operate, that laissez-faire economics was not really functional for the mission-driven um, economic goals that they had related to fighting a war. And so that they started to create ministries of basically administering and regulating prices and labor contracts in order to find enough labor and enough materiel to fight the war, to supply soldiers, so forth and so on, to maintain some degree of order at home, and supplying people with the necessities that they needed on the home front. So, and when World War One ended, it had become obvious during the war to people who were noticing, and they did notice, that the economy, it was a choice. Everything was a choice in relationship to policy, or almost, or certainly a lot of things were choices. That there weren't some kind of iron natural laws of the economy, but rather government policy decisions that could be different, and this created unrest among people who were lacking housing, lacking health care, lacking food. And on what was the home fronts, when the war ended, it was all home front, or also the returning soldiers and the wounded, and caring for veterans and so forth and so on, who had fought in that war. So anyway, so a bureaucracy was growing, and and to lead that approach, there were different schools of economics, and one, what Clara Mattei calls reconstructionist, and she may not be her coining of this word, but anyway, there was a reconstructionist idea that, well, let's use the government to help with social welfare, to that in some sense was saying the economic rules are up for grabs, and we will, by a process of progress, through a notion that things will change, that governments will provide more welfare programs for people during peacetime, based on this idea that, well, wait a minute, if we did that during wartime, we can also do it during peacetime. And also there was unrest, there was demand for this from, and there were strikes, and there were popular movements in both Great Britain and in Italy that were there was ferment there, and there were various economists who tried to, or social theorists who tried to create this reconstructionist idea. And there were during 1919 and 1920, as also in the United States, there was a similar upsurge, or there was also a Red Scare during that time. So also the Russian Revolution had happened. So there was the example of what was thought to be a workers' revolution in Russia, and the idea that there were certainly Soviets, there were certainly workers' councils that had been a part of that revolution, and were still active to some degree in Russia, though later were sidelined by the command economy ideas and the centralized planning focus of the later Soviet regime. But anyway, during 1919, 1920, there were also workers' councils in Italy, among other places, and there was also a movement, including, among others, Antonio Gramsci was part of it, a movement of that was saying, well, wait a minute, we can not only just reconstruct the economy but we can actually get rid of capitalist social relations and along the lines of a Marxist influenced or communist, either big C or small c, communistic or socialistic revolution, and that workers could be the commanders of the economy through or by directing their workplaces, and by taking them over would make the capitalist class obsolete. So anyway, this so there's a three different. There was the old laissez-faire. There was this new reconstructionist approach, and then there's also this you could say revolutionary or communistic approach, and it's obvious that Professor Mattei is most sympathetic to the revolutionary approach to the communist approach, but she also gives plenty of description and plenty of data in her book, which makes it worth reading, even if you're not fully on board with her assumptions and fully with her point of view about other approaches. So it provides provides a good history. It's a fairly scrupulous history of that time. And then anyway, so we sort of have a little bit of a skip after, let's say, 1920, 1921, or there's a certain black box in her book, and this is a little bit of a problem. And then she talks about how, not so problematically, she does start to explain, though, in terms of the intellectual history portion of the book, that economists sort of created then this sense of a science, an economic science that was located not in government per se, but in some institution, for instance, like basically central banks, that depoliticized economics and created again an order very similar to the one that the laissez-faire economists of the pre-war era championed, where there was a natural law of, which she calls austerity economics, or it was neoclassical economics, but based on an idea that there's a science of economics that is value neutral, that is not, and so it's not a love letter per se to capitalism overtly, but in its assumptions, it creates a model of the human being, a model of the economic actors in it that places capitalist and wealthy people at an extreme disadvantage versus poor people and working people, and this model is of the virtuous saver, what is the motor of the economy is the savings, and so and austerity is part of saving, because you inhibit your consumption, you inhibit your demands on government and on your employers, because you are trying to save, and you essentially defer consumption or not engage in it hardly at all in order to save money from your income. So this is only possible, as it was. Now there are certain periods of capitalism when it was possible for ordinary workers to save during this golden age of capitalism in the mid 20th century. But in most periods of capitalism, it is near impossible for ordinary people to save, or at least their savings can be wiped out very easily, especially in economies, in nations where there is very little social welfare and sort of literally forced saving programs or public pension programs, and also where things like medical expenses are covered by a very small portion of people's income via taxation. So there's no way that their savings can be wiped out by a medical emergency. So anyway, so this, but getting back to the model of the virtuous saver. So this virtuous saver is in fact, the model that almost that's baked into the economics as taught in Economics 101 to today. There's a dominant ideology in economics that that is very far from the reality of the real economy, that always is placing this kind of higher, or this value on people who save, okay, and that's the point of economy, and the saving. It sounds like, well, that the saving is supposed to drive investment and drive the economy. So what happens is that the entrepreneur is the best saver, and they use their savings to invest in their business. Well, as it turns out, banks actually lend the money to do that. And the government also helps them on the way to do that. So that's already a mythology, but that's the way the conventional economics, even till today, is and supposed economic science is designed. So Mattei does a very good job of explicating this theory. So anyway, so what happened was that these economists rushed into the breach, and they created these institutions that depoliticized government expenditure, and that they and government policy, and they said, well, no, that we need to take economics away from the hands of government, away from the hand, and put it in the hands of these central bankers, or these supposedly apolitical people, or maybe parts of the government that are somehow insulated from politics, from the demands of people. And so anyway, so this account is fairly well described by in this book, in the Capital Order. And anyway, Professor Mattei says this is the reinforcement of the Capital Order. So the Capital Order being capitalists own the means of production, and workers sell their labor to capitalists, and that's the way it should be. It's naturalized through this economic framework, even though it's based on this myth of the virtuous saver, and that everybody can be a virtuous saver, and all those things. So now, one of the things that drew me to reviewing this book and reading it is that she talks about paving the way to fascism. So in this way, the book is I am concerned, just sort of, this is not as, I'm going to put a little parentheses, I am personally concerned about exactly this issue of the tendency toward austerity in supposedly established, or supposedly scientific and definitely politically establishment economics, that the Democratic Party, among others, and also other center-left and centrist parties around the world, that they embrace, that this framework for economics reinforces the idea of austerity as being a virtue, and also weakens the case for those people to win in contests against quote unquote right wing quote unquote populists like Donald Trump, among others, or others who talk about government largesse toward their people, toward the people that for instance, Donald Trump is for not cutting Medicare and Social Security, and he looks like he could undercut some Democrats, though there's been some rejiggering of how the Democrats have been looking at the Social Security and Medicare since the State of the Union address by Biden. But still, it's not, Democrats are not united in a program of expanding Social Security and Medicare at all. So anyway, so basically the center and center left in the United States teeters also always in its sort of good student role, its role of being the virtuous good student, following quote unquote what establishment economics tells them, like for instance what Jerome Powell does, and at the Fed, and sort of allowing him to basically in an ideological and class warrior way destroy the economy, that they say, oh yes sir, yes sir, we'll do that, rather than seeing that it's a politicized process by which he operates and by which economic theory has been structured in here and also in other countries. So anyway, so this closing parentheses, this is a concern of mine that I think that economists and the belief in economists and the myth that economists are many economists are speaking an objective truth that's beyond our ken, or the ken of politicians. Anyway, that this could weaken, will weaken the resistance to fascism, and it will allow fascists through the door. So anyway, that's my concern. So anyway, but getting back to the history that Mattei is discussing, the Italian fascists actually, and this is something that she didn't discover, and she doesn't, but she's included in her book, and gone into some detail about, is that the Italian fascists took over. They didn't in 1922. They on the March on Rome, Mussolini took over as head of government, or as the I think prime minister at that point. But then he only became a dictator in 1926. So he was still, even though the fascists had dominance and had from 1922 on, they were not fully in control until the later 1920s. So, but anyway, he embraced this theory of economic science, and the idea that government shouldn't expend on social welfare, and he was trying to also, another feature of this is the embrace of the gold standard. So, and Professor Mattei makes some talks about the focus of the gold standard by a number of these economists, and that is a in my opinion a very important portion that I think makes an entrance in and out of the book, but I think should have been theorized more clearly by Mattei from the beginning. He talks about monetary austerity, but the notion of the gold standard being the virtue, the pinnacle of prudent management of the economy, is something that has been a ghost or a phantom throughout much of the economic history of the last 150 years or so, 200 years. But that's a shackle on actually recognizing how governments should be making policy, or it's a false way to look at money, but it's still, or it's a, let's say, certainly it's an austerian way to look at money, and it's a way that favors the rich and it favors the creditor class. Okay. Anyway, but Mussolini was, in the first years of his rule, and then later his dictatorship, was attempting to create or make Italy appear to be a good trade partner with, among others, Britain and the United States, or concerns within those, banks, and also manufacturing concerns within those countries. So he was trying to create a view and a regime within Italy of an economy of virtuous savers, of austerity-minded people, that social welfare would not be provided in a lot by the state. That the Italians were hardworking people that were ready to sacrifice their own well-being for the capitalists and for foreign capitalists too, and so therefore, and also that they were trying to reapply the gold standard, which had been lifted in World War I. That most governments had gotten off the gold standard for exactly the reason of the to try to supply their nations with armaments and with food and so forth and so on during the war effort. So anyway, so Mussolini was also a believer, and he used his political power and his thugs and so forth and so on to the paramilitaries that were part of his power that later became the Secret Service or the secret police and so forth and so on, that the fascists used to root out dissent, domestic dissent and so forth and so on, and also trade unionists, and to any independent trade unionists were eventually banned in Italy. They only could be fascist trade unions, so basically Potemkin trade unions, not independent ones, not ones that couldn't strike and have independent bargaining power for the workers. So anyway, in this way, fascism, adopted, or Italian fascism adopted this quote unquote liberal, and this was the fascists were approved, the Italian fascists, their orientation toward the economy, and this is a interesting section of the book, were looked at approvingly by a number of well-known liberal economists, and I believe also Keynes also thought. There was a phrase in which Keynes was also a believer in this austerity. Keynes later changed his mind about austerity. So you get a view of Keynes, and this is known by people who study Keynes closely. Keynes was not always the Keynes of the 1930s and 40s. He was a believer in kind of a hard money austerity until he changed his mind in the 1930s, and he is from his observation of the Great Depression. So, but anyway, but this is not. This book doesn't go into. This book only stays within the 1920s. So, anyway, I think there's what you get out of this is that. I'm not sure if actually Italian fascism. So this is where. So I'm getting now to pretty much. So the book ends in about the late 20s, and then there's an afterword that talks about the relevance of this period, and in fact that yes, there's a recurrence of this austerity. In fact, Italy in the Eurozone has been subject to all kinds of austerity efforts, and also economists. There's a whole class of economists who within and economic bureaucrats who have also become president of Italy, or or become prime minister of Italy, that have attempted to reinstate this kind of idea of economics as this sort of neutral science that still is all about austerity and all about the depoliticizing the struggle over state expenditure, basically, and who the state favors, who in terms of its policies, and in terms of its and the central bank combined with that, who is favored and who gets to be basically disadvantaged by state policy. So anyway, so that's in the afterword. Mattei talks about these things, and also, I mean, it occurs to me too that this is Italy looks like in this both under fascism and then also more recently, looks like a country in the periphery of capitalism, even though it's very one of the quite the wealthiest countries in the world. It's still has a peripheral relationship to Northern Europe and also the United States, in and in some areas, and it is certainly as a net importer within the eurozone has been there. The bad medicine of austerity by the European Central Bank has been offered it as well as to the quote unquote pigs, the Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain. So and this is this is the imbalance of the eurozone is something that I don't want to get into too much here, but it seems like that's part of the inspiration for Mattei focusing on this particular episode in history. But anyway, so in doing further reading, so I'm going to now bring in my own perspective and also my further reading about this area, though it's not, again, I'm not an expert in this area. I am, an amateur in this particular area of history, but I am someone who knows something about it, and also I'm noticing that this narrative or the sequence of events in Mattei's book doesn't quite explain everything. So to get back to not everything, but important, key, relevant facts. So the ascension to power of fascists in Italy does not seem to be closely related to austerity, or at least the case is not made in this book that the austerity-minded economists created the political circumstances where Mussolini and the fascists could take power in Italy. It's not clear why they took power from this book. There will be other books that might make it clearer about why Mussolini was so powerful or became so powerful within the politics of Italy, and so, but on the other hand, he adopted austerity as his own philosophy of economics for a while, and then this is my bringing in my knowledge from what I've read on, among other places, Wikipedia on the economics of fascism, and other sources. Again, not a long study, but just simply a cursory run through. Like I'm trying to create a framework for this book review here. Obviously, fascism created many institutions, including social welfare institutions in Italy. So it wasn't only purely austerity was not their only philosophy. And what one comes away from in looking at their economic philosophy, but also that of the Nazis in Germany when later on in the 1930s and 40s, is that there is no single economic theory that is fascist, that is the fascist economic theory, that fascists are opportunists, political opportunists, and they see their intent is political power, using political power for their mythic quest to create a mythic people, or some kind of bygone era, recreate a bygone era that excludes some people, that involves the oppression of some people and the brutal suppression and of some people, and also the declaration of the superiority of one's people over some other people outside the bounds of the kind of racial entity or national entity of some kind, and that attainment of political power, whatever economic theory will work to attain that political power and to keep it, is what they will adopt within some bounds. And also that political power, they usually means aligning themselves with the existing economic power structure. So allying themselves and becoming the hench people of the sort of the dirty the people who do the dirty work for the bag people, so to speak, or whatever, the people who do the dirty work for the capitalist class in a time of desperation, when they are challenged by, among other things, a workers' movement, when they're challenged by the circumstances of capitalism falling apart. They're challenged by challenges where their tools don't work anymore, and they turn to, or there's this group that emerges that is these opportunistic, sadistic, political grouping that has a demagogic appeal to a largish group of people, not necessarily a majority, but that creates a cohort of shock troops for. So anyway, so this seems to be more the economics and also politics of fascism, based on my reading of this book and also the reading of these other materials. I would have liked Professor Mattei to, I mean, even though this is my words and she might disagree with what I'm saying right now, it seems to be left out that there seems to be more in stopping the book in the 1920s. You're left with the false impression that fascism is only about austerity, when, anyway, the Nazis also did not operate an austerity regime in Germany, even though they did ascend to power largely because of the austerity regime of the Brüning government in the 1930, 1932, after the Great Depression, when the Great Depression, or after the stock market crash, and when there was mass unemployment and so forth and so on, there was, both the communists and also the Nazis grew in electoral power, and then the Nazis were favored by the power structure because they were, again, the henchmen for capital, or for the aristocracy and capital, the Prussian aristocracy, and that they similarly, Mussolini was the guy who did the dirty work for the elite, the royalty of Italy, and also the capitalist class, and so both seem to show this similarity. But it was the Nazis, in a way, who did come to power because of austerity, because of actual austerity policies, not the idea of austerity, and they ruled based on their economics was based on, among other things, inflating the economy, or creating money, actually, that was hidden by the Schacht created a form of money, a scrip that was used to be converted into Reichsmark. But that was hidden from the outside world as they were rearming. In other words, so the rearmament of Germany was in fact financed by an inflationary, inflationary is the wrong word, but it was a form of deficit spending that was expansionary form of fiscal policy. And so this is more typical of what one consider the economics of fascism, though again, as I think given what I've learned from this book and then from other reading, that fascists are opportunists, and they see where is it that they can gain power by proposing certain economic policies. So anyway, I think that is one blind spot there, that basically fascism is made to be about austerity by this book, or you get the wrong impression from it, and it's left out of this book that there were changes in the way that, and also that in Germany it was actually fascism. Not only economics, austerity-based economics wasn't actually sort of conceived of as an idea, but it actually was imposed by the government of the Center Party in 1930, 1932, the Bündung, or the coalition government that excluded the Nazis. So the Nazis could then take credit for, or could gain popular support by mobilizing unemployed people, among other things. So anyway, so this also gets to sort of, this is again me, and this is not so much, this is more me reacting to the information in this book, that I think that there's and that I probably should do another video based on this idea, but it seems to me that there's also something earlier on in the book that I found, as someone who's read a number of books about, times of worker uprising and workers taking over factories and workers, throughout in the 150-year, 200-year, history of industrial capitalism. And it often ends up, so there's a story of a heroic or hopeful view of what could happen with this uprising, and somehow it's defeated somehow. And so it's defeated so one has a sense of, I'm with these people, I feel sympathetic to them. It sounds like a great idea. Let's do this thing, this socialism, communism thing, sort of. And at the same time, it fails, literally. And in this book, it doesn't really say how it fails or why it fails. And then what's left out of the book is actually Gramsci's later, musings about how this happened, his ideas in the prison notebooks. And also when we come to the theory about hegemony and about war of movement versus a war of position, that were his ideas about this, which were really his most important contributions to political theory and Marxist theory as well, more generally, or neo-Marxist, or, post-Marx Marxist theory, that were some of the most original ideas and most productive ideas, I think, in that tradition. But anyway, that's out of the book. But why these moments of just I'm frustrated to read about them and not understand. So what was it about them why did they lose? Why is it that a couple of years later we have Mussolini, this unsavory character, this political opportunist and hyper macho authoritarian. How did he take over, and how did he create the buy-in for the Italian people? There was resistance to him. He wasn't, univocally loved. There were partisans who fought him and fought the Nazis and so forth and so on. And actually one of them is the great uncle of who perished, of Professor Mattei. Why did they lose? Why if they had such great ideas, if it was so helpful, why? So I think some of this relies, and this is me totally, outside the realm of this book, or it's that I think Marxism focuses one on a proletariat that doesn't have own means of production, but there is a group that is being antagonized, that is become the shock troops of fascism, who have something but not a lot, who have small businesses, who are we'll call the petty bourgeoisie, or maybe the upper class in the United States, the labor aristocracy, or anyway, those people are no longer the proletariat of the 19th century, who possess very, very little. They maybe own the clothes on their back and nothing else, or and so that group of people still exists. There are people, but it's a mixture. There's so many other groups in society that one can't build a political theory based only on a proletariat. One needs to include the people more generally, and some of the people are people who own businesses, who own farms, who are, whatever, who are small businesses, and that needs to be part, and they work very hard. Okay, they are working people. Okay, some of them eventually get to a point where they just tell other people to do what so they're no longer quote unquote working with their hands. But then that managing capacity also something that is anti-progressive, anti-socialistic, okay, anti-socialism. So that's where I think we need to really, instead of looking at it as this sort of, or as this kind of ancestor worship, okay, of valuing Marx and his segmentation of classes, working class, a capitalist class, and maybe petty bourgeoisie somewhere in there, and seeing that as the primary lens to which to look at history, it helps with looking at some things. It still helps. There's still aspects of, you have to understand much of the policy of the United States government recently is about labor discipline, about disciplining people. But there are this in-between people that I think need to be recruited to the side of the workers. Okay, they need to be, and they weren't. The communists of the 1918, 1990, 1920 didn't recruit those people. They fought with some of them, and they felt, and so there was and the fascists were able to use their this is again use the shock troops they could get from those groups that were antagonized, that were considered to be opponents by nature of the theory that communists / socialists had during that period. They were antagonized, and so they went to the other side. So you need to have a theory that understands that people also can own small or even semi-small, pieces of capital, of tools, so forth and so on. But we need to understand where they are, not where they're regressive and where they turn to the dark side and turn against progress and against people, and where they are also doing things that are valuable, that are important, that are and that they've created things and they continue to create things, okay, and that the knowledge that they have about their business or whatever it is, some of it is extremely valuable for society overall and should be rewarded, even in a socialism that you could imagine. So anyway, so I that's a speculative thing, and I could immediately be labeled as anti-Marxist and pro-bourgeois for saying what I just said. But I think that if you look at the history of how in other words, how one could possibly get to a post-capitalist order, or a post-laissez-faire, or a pro-worker, pro-people, quasi-capitalist, strong social democracy where government, regulates, certain industries very hard or owns critical parts of the economy and manages them for the public good, any number of different options, but just getting us out of where we are today, and also getting us out of using the tools, okay, that we're using now that mandate that we destroy the livelihood of the co-evolved biosphere, our own the climate that is conducive to our biologies, that using those tools, so it's not just the social relations of production, it's the means of production, and understanding that they are part of focusing on changing them very, very fast is almost as critical or more critical than the social relations, the relationship between people. That is the focus of the Marxist analysis. So anyway, I think I've gone on very long here, and I just want to stop here, and I hope that some people will get to the end here. And anyway, please, if you did like this video, if you got anything out of it, please like it, and also please comment below if you have any thoughts about my review, either related to the book itself or my opinions about the book, or my then post my speculations or my theorizing that goes beyond the book. Anyway, so please subscribe to Politics 2100 if any of this was semi-interesting, and please look at the next video if you like, and I hope to see you there.